male peer support is a concept I developed in 1987 under the guidance of my supervisory committee at York University. And I'm going to talk a bit about York University in a few minutes, not as a plug, but it was a very exciting time period being there at that time for reasons I'll talk about. And I define male peer support as the attachments to male peers and the resources that these men provide which encourage and legitimate woman abuse. What I must say as a prelude, 25 years I've been working in this area, and one of my major concerns is to find out what motivates men to be abusive. And there's different explanations, of course, and you'll see that I start off with a fairly simple one, and then over the past 25 years I've developed more complex explanations for it, attempts to link broader social forces with micro-level processes. But having said that, having done work in university and college communities, in rural southeast Ohio, in poor public housing estates in eastern Ontario, and examining the work that's been done in rural South Africa, inner city St. Louis, I must conclude that one of the most powerful determinants of various types of violence against women, regardless of the age, regardless of the intimate relationship status, is male peer support. And there's a growing body of research to substantiate this. The men who are most likely to be abusive are those obviously who have patriarchal attitudes and beliefs, but that's too simplistic, right? Because patriarchy is a variable, right? We live in a patriarchal society, Canada is one too, but not all men are abusive, right? Patriarchy is a variable. So I think we've moved well beyond, single factor explanations, but we understand that broader forms of inequality are fundamentally important. So the men who are abusive have these attitudes, but they're more likely to be abusive if they're embedded in peer groups that have these attitudes, and in peer groups that encourage and justify this problem. And one of the most interesting things about male peer support and violence against women research is that people like myself are committed to finding out what motivates these men to encourage other men or to justify the abuse. If you look at the delinquency literature or youth in conflict with the law literature, I think most of you know that one of the most robust correlates is peer associations. But the literature, regardless of whether it's in Australia, Canada, or the United States, just simply shows, look, peer associations are connected. And they don't go further in trying to explain how peers motivate and encourage each other. And what I find very interesting, I was talking to Martin Schwartz about this the other day, is that that literature within the body of knowledge on delinquency that looks at peer associations is completely gender blind. It ignores violence against women altogether. And yet we know from Jody Miller's new research, her work in inner city St. Louis on the lives of young African American women, that male peer support is a very powerful determinant of the abuse that they experience in inner city areas. Again, this is what I've found, and I've mentioned that before. And this is, below is a picture of a book that focused on two theories, my original male peer support model, which I'll show you, and a more complex one, which I'll show you. And we tested these theories using the Canadian National Survey of Woman Abuse in University and College Dating. And what's interesting when you think about Canada, I mean, Canadians always compare themselves to their neighbors south of the border. And maybe I'm wrong, I think perhaps increasingly Australians are comparing themselves to the US too because of the increasing US influence, especially during after 9/11, the Howard government, and then the free trade agreement that was set up, and so on and so forth. So please correct me if I'm wrong, but we always see this kind of creeping US influence coming into other areas, especially in globalization. But in Canada, we are the #1 trading partner, and as the late Prime Minister Elliott Trudeau once said, living next to the United States is like a mouse sleeping next to an elephant. Every twitch, every grunt impacts us. And Canadians like to think of themselves as part of a kinder, gentler nation, yet the reality is our rates of violence against women are just as high, if not higher, than those in the United States. And this is what the survey uncovered, and we decided to find out, test some theories, and the male peer support perspective jumped out very clearly. I want to give you this brief history. Toronto, people complain about the weather here or winters. Take a look at that picture. The ironic thing is York University was modeled, the architecture was modeled after the University of Southern California. I don't know who the idiot was that did that. And this gentleman pictured here is Martin Schwartz, a good friend and colleague of mine. We've worked so closely together on male peer support. And I'll just tell you the story. What happened was, in Canada, in the early to late 80s, it was a very exciting time period. And the feminist community had a very strong influence on the federal government. And that's why the term woman abuse emerged in Canada. The term woman abuse was used because it clearly identified the problem as one of being gendered. And there was a consensus, within the Canadian context about that. Even the federal government recognized that. And also, not only because the problem was gendered, but also woman abuse encompasses a wide range of violence against women: economic, spiritual, coercive control, and so on and so forth. So multidimensional in nature. And we realized, I was talking to Heather about this, we've got some serious challenges facing us. People are trying to get us to use gender-neutral language. I must admit, no offense to anyone, I don't like the term domestic violence because it suggests that both parties are equally violent. There may be those who say, well, look, it's more inclusive. What about same-sex relationships? I would argue then call it violence in same-sex relationships, because those who are opposed to the work we're doing are trying to change the language. We're moving back to, and naming the problem is very important. I'm also troubled about the term intimate partner violence, because it also degenders the problem, right? And it suggests that both parties are equally violent. So at that time, I was working with some wonderful people, the late Michael D. Smith, who did the pioneering Toronto Woman Abuse Survey, which I would argue is still the best methodological project ever done. And it was the first attempt to integrate the canons of mainstream survey research with feminist concerns, and Mike, God rest his soul, generated some of the highest rates of violence against women and had a major impact on policy and practice. Desmond Ellis was focusing on separation violence, and we know that's a very dangerous time. And I was their student, and I decided, well, okay, because everyone was talking about, quote, wife beating at that time, as you may recall, from the early 80s or late 70s to the mid 80s. And I was concerned about violence in dating relationships. And no one in Canada was looking at this. I conducted the first study under my dissertation. And that's how I came to develop the theory. My committee said, you're not just going out and gathering data, you're going to develop a theory. And how I came to this theory, and I should have known better as a white male of privilege, because as a white male of privilege, many of us have a lot of baggage. We have experiences that we're uncomfortable with, that we don't like to think about. The good news is we've changed, with the assistance of our sisters and our mothers and other progressive people. But I was sitting in a pub preparing for a seminar in 1986. It was 10 o'clock in the morning having a coffee. And a group of young men, it's 1986, a group of young men came into the pub. One was very distraught, and they sat next to me. He was upset because he took a young woman out for dinner Saturday night, and she wouldn't have sex with him. And the other men made all kinds of derogatory comments. I won't go into them here. And some said, well, you know what to do the next time. And then this light went off in my mind. And then I started examining the literature, and it only made sense, but there was next to no work done on this area. And I thought, how can this be? When we know two of the most robust determinants of any type of violence in our society are biological, really. Age, right, youth, 18 to 24, very high risk, and sex, men. And I thought, okay, since we have these two risk groups, And then we know that peer associations are very important with other types of crimes. Why wouldn't they be important with this one? And so that's what led me on this terrain. Here's the original model. Now, I like doing theory, but I'm of the school of thought. It's not theory for the sake of theory. I think, I agree with Kurt Lewin. I don't know if any of you have heard of him. He was one of the founders of modern social psychology. He made a very famous statement that nothing is so practical as good theory. I mean, how do we find a cure for physical ailments? We need to know the cause. And I see theory as feeding into practice, as feeding into policy. That's why I do theory. Now, in North America, especially the United States, which is the land of number crunching, there's this movement away from theory, and everyone's caught up in all this statistical voodoo, or what my UK colleague Jock Young calls voodoo criminology, or Elliot Curry, he's going to be at this conference at QUT called So What Criminology. In fact, I read some of these journals, and it's like, you know, reading something out of the American Mathematical Association, and I throw them away half the time, because what value do they have? I mean, it's just caught up in this kind of a fetishism with numbers. So I think we need to know, we need something to guide us. We need data, but data has to be examined in a context. So this is how I started off. Dating, relationships. Now, I don't know what it's like in Australia, but in North America now they don't use the term. They use the term hooking up. Do they use it here too? Yeah. And it's very dangerous, this hookup culture, because it's characterized by high rates of sexual assault as well, because the men control the hooking up culture. But that's for a whole other topic. But at that time was dating. Dating causes stress. The stress I was referring to is the stress that men experience from challenges to their authority or rejections. A woman says, no, I don't want, or I should say their perceived authority. A woman says, I don't want to have sex with you, or I'm leaving you for another man. So, you know, grounded within the context of challenging one's perceived sense of masculine entitlement. Now, some men cope with this stress themselves. They may be abusive, or they may depart from the relationship. Others turn to their peers for support. And when you're looking at youth, especially in schools, I mean, the most important social support for them are their peers. And this is why I think from you know, policy and practice, we need to address peer influence. I know people are doing it with alcohol consumption and so on, but it needs to be done as well with violence against women. So the type of support these men provide can translate into woman abuse. In other words, you know, men will say, well, you know, hit her, she's a gold digger, she's a teaser. Now, what happens is men don't automatically, you know, not all men follow that line of reasoning. The men who are most likely to be abusive do. And after, we shouldn't assume that after they hit or sexually assault, they feel really good about themselves. They know that despite, you know, rape myths and so on, that they've done something wrong. They're aware of it, but the male peer support can also provide justifications for it as well. It's okay, don't worry about it, she's a bad woman anyway. And then, of course, some men don't need to have stress to be influenced by their peers. And I ask my students to do an experiment, because we know that rape, and we know that sex for young men is about status among their peers. Very much. It's not about bodily pleasure, it's not about intimacy. It is for some men, but for a lot it isn't. And there's a lot of chatter about their sexual relations on a Monday morning. I asked my students to do this experiment. I first of all asked them, how many of you go to bars? Most of them put up their hands. I said, okay, how many of you stayed for last call, what we call last call in Canada, you know, the last call? And many put up their hands. I said, have you ever observed men who haven't, if they've gone out in a group and they haven't ended up meeting someone or going home with someone, they scramble like flies and wolves to try to find someone. You watch this, it's truly incredible. Why? Why this sense of desperation to be able to go home with someone? It's not about, oh God, I'm so horny, I need to have sex. It's about status among their peers. And I think that's something that we really need to address, you know, and this is all within the context of healthy relationships anyway. Okay. I tested the theory. I don't think I need to put the slide up. And this was with a sample of 308 men. And then I went on to use much larger samples. And what these men who experienced dating life event stress and who had ties to abusive peers were the most likely to engage in this type of behavior. And I think the data have some very important policy and practice implications. And we can talk about that in a few minutes as well. Now I want to turn to this big complex model here. One of the concerns, this is how I joined up with Martin Schwartz. I met him in 1987 at the American Society of Criminology meetings. And he was interested in my work, and I was a very young scholar at the time. And he read the original male peer support model, and we sat down and talked about it. And I recognized this too, that it was focused too much on individual factors, focused too much on the micro level. And so this is kind of, at first I thought this was just simply a teaching or a heuristic model, but I found out during the process of writing the book that Courtney Franklin and some of her colleagues tested this entire model, which I thought it's impossible to do. And they actually found support for all of it. It's a new article that just came out. But what you can see, I won't go through all the factors here. I won't go through all of them. But what I tried to do is look at the ways in which broader social forces influence these male peer support processes, because men just don't hang out with other men and, promote abuse or justify it. They're influenced heavily by the media, by politicians, and so on. And by the way, I was talking to friends here, and on the plane, I mean, the whole world's watching what happened with Julia Gillard. And you should see the international interpretations or hear about them. There's some very, very powerful language out there and questioning about, the treatment of women in politics. But one of the things that I'm deeply concerned about is pornography. This is the research I'm doing now. And today's porn is extremely, extremely violent and extremely racist, easily accessible, and very easily accessible. And rape is a common theme. In fact, Anna Bridges and her colleagues who are in the States conducted a study of 50 of the best or the most popular pornographic videos. 304, I should say. And in 90% of them involve physical aggression, men towards women. Slapping, punching, choking, that's a common theme. 50% involve derogatory verbal aggression. And boys are on average are starting at the age of 11 watching pornography. And I'm talking about violent stuff. This stuff is so violent that pornographers don't even know what to do next. And this is the research I'm moving in now, and I found it strongly connected to male peer support. And the world of fantasy and reality is becoming blurred. We're not talking about yesterday's Playboy. We live in a post-Playboy world, and it's very, very disturbing. And news sites pop up all the time. And rape is a very powerful myth. Very, very powerful myth. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a pornographic video that doesn't involve harm and pain. You'd be hard-pressed. And so, this is the message the boys are getting about women today. And I'd argue that pornography is probably the most powerful message about gender relations. I mean, you can watch mainstream media as well, of course. I mean, rap music and so on. I mean, rap music's just filled with misogyny. There are other things we know, but pornography, I mean, boys are watching it ad nauseum. We have survey data. I won't bore you with it, but it's something that we need to be careful with. And I bet those of you who are on the front line working with battered women or working with batterers are hearing. How many of you are hearing more about pornography? Okay, one person. If you ask, you'll hear. Believe me, you'll hear. Because it's part and parcel, and we're finding very strong evidence that it's a routine part. Now, we don't know whether the abuse comes first or the pornography consumption comes first. We don't know. But we know there is a very powerful relationship. And we know people now have moved outside of the labs and are doing survey research, in-depth interviews with women. My rural Southeast Ohio study, and this was in a very poor part of Southeast Ohio, women, 65% of them talked about pornography, their partner's consumption. And what you'll see in the United States, you'll see these giant pornography department stores on the highways, and they're in rural areas. There's this one called the Lion's Den, and it's the Walmart of pornography. It's huge. And the rural areas, don't forget, we see the boundaries between rural areas and urban areas blurring with new technologies and so on and so forth. And actually, rural areas have higher rates of crime, many types of crime than do urban ones. But the data, our Canadian National Survey data, show that. I moved on to do some other types of theoretical work, which I won't go into, trying to, well, there's one. I'll just quickly show you a slide and give, I think it has some significant implications. This gentleman, he's a conservative gentleman, Travis Hershey, and what he tried to do, he tried to explain not why do kids commit delinquent acts, but why don't they? And he developed a theory of conformity. It was completely gender blind. Now, what Martin Schwartz and Alberto Guidenti and I were thinking about, when we look at the alarming high rates of violence against women in universities and colleges. In fact, it's interesting how, the police and the media always focus on ethnic minorities as being the highest risk, right? Aboriginal people in this country, First Nations people in Canada, people of color and Hispanic people in the United States. Those are the images we see on TV. Those are the people who are routinely stopped and searched. Those are the people that the general public think are the most criminogenic. However, when we look at these young kids who are primarily middle class in our institutions of higher learning, these are some of the most criminogenic. And when you have rates in North America, 1 out of every 4 women in the past year experiencing some type of sexual assault, you would think that that would raise all kinds of alarm bells. But mind you, in this day and age of the backlash, universities and colleges go out of their way to minimize it, to hide it, and so on. But having said that, with such high rates, our argument is it is the men who are not sexist, who are not patriarchal, and who are not abusive, who are the deviants. It is the abusive and sexist men who are the conformists. And so we turned Travis Hershey's theory upside down. And of course, we know that many of these people are immune to any sanction. Look at the Penn State football incident. I hate it when they call it a scandal. Why call it a scandal? This is an atrocity. I mean, there's scandals, tragedies, the whole university covered this up. I mean, this was what Michael Salter calls organized child sexual abuse. Similarly, at colleges and universities, when it comes to the abuse of women, I would argue that this is organized sexual abuse as well, because the universities go out of their way to hide it and to encourage youth not to come forward because they're worried they'll be designated as, date rape university, and they're worried about money and so on. And then we went on to, I won't show the slides because I'd like to leave some time for discussion. I'm getting close, I guess, near the end, and I purposely only wanted to go for 35 minutes so we can have some discussion.
But you started late, Walter.
Oh, okay, okay, all right. I was also concerned, one of the things that bothered me, and I'll just very quickly show this slide. There was a time in the movement when we wanted to raise much awareness, and there was the claim that all women are at risk of being abused. And this was important, right, because we wanted to raise awareness, but the reality is not all women are at equal risk, and not all men are at equal risk of being abusive. There are variations. And there was this great fear to talk about poor women or poor men, because remember the myths that we had to deal with, the stereotypes that batterers are drunken men, batterers are immigrants, batterers are the poor people, and of course, the popular culture supported this with Andy Capp. Remember that cartoon? And so on. And the movies like The Godfather. Remember The Godfather, where I don't know how many people have seen it. It's a classic, right? Yeah. And so there was this worry, and I remember within the feminist community, no, we can't talk about the truly disadvantaged because this will fuel stereotypes. But what I found was, in my public housing research, the rates were alarmingly high. 19.3% of the women in the 6 public housing estates experienced some form of violence in the past year. That's a reality. That was higher than in the general population. And I developed this theory with Martin Schwartz because what we're seeing now, and people will have access to the slides, right, Heather? Yeah, okay, good. What we're seeing now, especially in North America, I think the Pacific Rim's been somewhat immune from this, but it's going to hit the Pacific Rim like a ton of bricks, especially China, and I'll explain why. What's happened is we have massive deindustrialization. North America was big on manufacturing, and now everything's outsourced, right? All these little electronic toys we made are made in we play with are made in China. Manufacturing is gone. There is no traditional working class. Work has disappeared, staggering levels of youth unemployment, and so on and so forth. And this has had an impact. Men losing their work, their jobs, and we have research showing, and this is not a stereotype. We have hard quantitative evidence showing that working class men have a stronger adherence to the ideology of familial patriarchy than do middle class and upper class men. I'm not saying there's no patriarchy there, but we're looking at a variable, a degree. When people lose their jobs, many of them are not only economically excluded, but they're also physically excluded and move into public housing estates and so on. Unemployed men are at greater risk of spending time with other unemployed men, drinking, doing drugs, and lamenting about the loss of their masculine status. And these types of male peer support dynamics stemming from the change in the economy translate into violence against women. So this was another project that we were working on, and the economy has a significant impact. Same in Australia. I'm reading some very interesting literature about economic change and masculinities in the Australian context, with the disappearance of extractive industries, or else the coal mining is a big issue. Kerry Carrington and Russell Hogg have done some very good stuff. Now in the United States, even the US Justice Department's worried about coal mining and violence against women, because we have cross-cultural research that shows in places where men band together, sleep together, and so on, you have the highest risks of violence against women. And in coal mining communities, we see this. In oil communities, we see this too. And so it's important to look at economic factors and how they impact on male peer group dynamics. And there's some other theories. But let's move to the question, what is to be done? And male peer support theory has been used by Molly Dragowitz to explain fathers' rights groups. People are explaining sexist police subcultures. The theory that I've developed has moved into other areas. But this question, quickly, what is to be done? What do we do with this, right? What do we do with it? Well, I think we need to, first of all, use new technologies. Here's a list of a few things. We have to, especially when we deal with youth. You know, I don't think I'm a Luddite. I don't think I'm that old, but have you noticed that youth don't talk to each other anymore, really? I'll give you a good example. My daughter brought her friends over to the house, and they're nice people, and they ran upstairs, and they're going to hang out together. So I thought I'd go up and say hello. I opened the door. Laptops are open, iPads are open, and so on. I said, good God, didn't you people come here to be together? You know, people text each other in the other room, dinner's ready. You know, I mean, this is a reality, right? They spend more time interacting electronically. And so I think we have to understand this reality, and we need to, you know, use Facebook and Twitter and all of these other things to you know, send messages out, because that's where the kids are. Unfortunately, it's sad. I find it highly problematic in many ways, not only in terms of social relations, but you know, issues like obesity, health, and so on and so forth. But there's another very serious danger. The youth are multitasking. They do homework 1 second and flip to a porn site the next. And this is what the new technologies do, and they are doing this. We need to take it to the streets. One of the things. Technology is important, but politicians don't even listen to that. Our prime minister ignores Facebook and all these things, even though there's, you know, thousands of people who protest. But it was interesting in Quebec, province of Quebec, when the students protested the tuition increases and marched, the Quebec politicians listened. the Occupy movement, the First Nations Idle No More movement in Canada. These things are important. I don't want to sound nostalgic, but going back to the 60s, if we look at what youth did on all levels, the women's movement, the gay, lesbian, transgendered movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, I think the streets are very important, and what we're seeing with the Arab Spring is something. So I'm kind of pushing that kind of radical approach because it's in your face, CNN will cover it, and so on. Boycotting. You know, we go to hotels, and I'm always honored to be invited and put up in a nice hotel, but every hotel you're in, turn on the TV, and you will see a whole list of adult movies. And now they put a little asterisk at the bottom of the screen. The title of the movie won't be on your bill. And what I do is I go down to the front desk and I say, can I speak to the manager? And of course the clerk behind goes, oh, is there something wrong, sir? Well, yeah, there is. Can I speak to the manager? The manager comes out, and I said, look, I have a problem. You know, many of the hotels, especially in the United States, like the Marriott chain, or in Canada, brag about being a smoke-free environment. We're proud to bring you a smoke-free environment. I said, why can't you be proud to bring me a gender harassment-free environment? How do you think I feel lying in my bed when somebody's watching this stuff in the next room, upstairs and downstairs? And these films are, you know, very, very hurtful and painful. The new genre, I won't go into all the details, but it's very disturbing. So the Minnesota Men's Alliance is urging corporations and conferences to boycott hotels and convention centers that, you know, disseminate this stuff. And I think that's a really important thing, hit people in the financial end. Now this thing, in Australia people are doing this, but how do we transform well-meaning men into, you know, active men? A well-meaning man, most men will say, you know, I'm sure if you've given workshops, I don't hit, I want my family to thrive, I want my children to do well and whatever. Fine, good, I respect that, we all respect that. But how do we convince these people that silence is a form of communication? How do we turn these well-meaning men, because we know that most men aren't violent, but we need to get more men into the movement. How do we do that? I mean, of course, there are ways, there are other people that have strategies and initiatives and efforts, and there's an international movement, but this is very important. How do we get these guys who are basically good to take that next leap, to form this majority? And I think that's really important. We have to deal with homophobia and these other things too. And then the home and the school. Jody Miller, in her work on the lives of young African-American girls, made a very powerful point in her book, Getting Played. The elementary and middle schools are training grounds for sexual harassment. You know, young boys pulling girls' bra straps, lifting up their skirts and everything. Teachers will go, oh, that's no big deal. Or else people come up with bullying programs. I'm sick and tired of hearing that because they're gender neutral. And they borrow from this Norwegian scholar, Olwitz, who has no understanding of the gendered nature of these activities on the schoolyards. And I think it's very important that in the schools we have a constant training and focusing on the gender issues. Too often the trainings that do occur are one shot at a time. Okay, we had a presentation to the kids, done, it's over. The home, I think it's really important that we spend more time talking to our children about these issues. Like talking about, and also when I talk to men, so be very careful when your young boy is sitting there watching TV with you and you're watching some ad that's sexist and you laugh at it. That person's watching everything. Yeah. So there's a few examples of things we need to do. And these are practical things that really don't cost that much money, you know? And I think my firm belief is that in all areas of crime, the most effective means of prevention are those that involve informal processes of social control. In other words, what we do as a community or as a social group. I'll give you a very quick example. Get a young boy, I saw him in Ottawa, Ontario, he was caught shoplifting. Didn't seem like a bad boy, but I saw him, he was crying, and the store owner said he was going to call the police. And And he called his parents. The parents were good customers and neighbors. That boy was more worried about what his parents had to say than the police. And I think that's a very powerful statement when we sensitize the community that we don't find this acceptable, and we engage in reintegrative shaming, if you will, which comes out of the Australian criminological work. How do we bring people into the fold? But what can we do ourselves? The criminal justice system has failed. It has failed on so many crimes. I'm not saying we don't need the police, but this compartmentalizing social problems along bureaucratic lines is a major problem. Why do we think, if we can't succeed, in the United States it's a classic example of the failure of a war on drugs, the failure of prisons. Why do we think it would work with violence against women? I know the symbolic message. I know we fought so hard to get the justice system to recognize that, but I think what we do as individuals, as groups and communities will have a stronger impact. So I'll end on that, and I thank you for your time, your patience, and I look forward to your comments and questions. You're asking a very important question. I turned to two models, two community-based models. One is Duluth, Minnesota, which I'm sure you've heard of, and the other is London, Ontario. And what those communities have done is there's partnerships with different parts of the communities. They're all working very hard together. The police, the sexual assault centers, the violence against women centers, the schools. These communities have made a major commitment to develop coordinated, community-based, collaborative models. And I think that we should turn to these programs for examples of best practices. How did these communities become so united? London, Ontario, I would argue, is probably one of the safest places in the entire Canada for women. And same with Duluth, Minnesota. So I think if we talk to those people, I know we get very leery, especially in other countries, of importing, and we have to recognize cultural context and so on. I'm fully sensitive to that. But I think they offer good models. How did they start? How did they get people at the table? And again, I return to this point of compartmentalizing social problems along bureaucratic lines. I think too often we've got to break people out of the mold by saying, look, violence is the responsibility of this group. Health is the responsibility of that group, and so on. How do we make it the responsibility of a number of groups? Because it all impacts on each other. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yes, thank you. That does help.
And those people there would be more than happy to talk to you. They're wonderful people, and they'll share anything that they have. Yes, I'll mention it to Heather. There's some really good people, and they'll be more than happy to share. They also have a website. There's some websites, but yeah, and there's lots of information. But they worked very hard. The first thing is the community as a whole made a decision that this has got to stop. And I think the first step, and same with Duluth, is that the community has to say that we want to do something. And it's the old adage, if there's a will, there's a way. I think the first step is mobilizing the will, and then trying to harness everyone's strengths. Because I think everyone brings something to the table, and respecting each person's approach, because there will be differences, of course. But I'll share this information with Heather, and she can send it to you. My answer to that is that to get the men to be reflexive, which you obviously do, right, to get them to think about their lives, but also to think about, because many of the programs, and I can't comment on yours, but I know many that I've seen, and they have different theoretical models that drive them, or some of them are hybrids or whatever, but many of them get the men to focus on their own lives and their own minds and experiences, which is good and important, I understand that. But I think to talk about their relations with other men as well, because what happens is when they leave your group, they go and talk to other men anyway. And I'm hearing a lot of people say that it's very difficult in a 26-week program or 12-week program, because when they walk out the door, they go back into these social contexts, which have all this patriarchal support. So I would recommend maybe some exercises where they talk about, peer relations and what is it like you go back to the pub, and what do you guys talk about, or when you watch the football match, or, do you get some messages there? And I think it's important because I bet a healthy portion of the men in your group have friends or had friends who are abusive. And how can the other exercise is as ambassadors from your group, how do they take from your group and bring some good to the world? Like maybe, and I defer to you because you're in the field, but I was thinking about how they can take from your group not only change within themselves, but how can they bring about change in their community? And I've seen this. There are people who've come out, especially in First Nations communities, where in Canada it's estimated that 8 out of every 10 First Nations women has experienced some type of abuse. But we're seeing with healing lodges and sweat lodges and all kinds of indigenous techniques that the men are being reintegrated and seen as being healed, and they're going out and educating. They're talking to other men and they're talking about their experiences. I've been there, I've done that, look, this, and I think that's important. That they're part of the solution. It's not only solving their lives, but taking their experiences and turning them into a positive element. I think your question is extremely important. What I'm seeing in the North American context is that the education system's so resistant. We can't have this in the classroom. We can't talk about this. You have parent-teacher associations. No, we can't talk about sex. No, we can't talk about abuse, and so on. There's this attempt to just, silence it. And again, when I talked about bullying, I'm fed up with that term. I know it's important on one level, but it's a gender-neutral thing, and we're ignoring the fact that who are the primary targets of bullying? It's women, it's children perceived to be gay, lesbian, transgendered, it's people of different ethnic, cultural backgrounds, and I think what we need to do is, as communities outside the education system, put a lot of pressure on and say, look, you're not doing your job. You're not addressing the hidden curriculum, because I am as frustrated as you are. They won't let us go into the classrooms, and if we do, it's for once a year. It has to be sanitized. It has to be gender neutral, and you're right. It is like an ongoing problem. I think maybe we should make more demands, and I think this is why I'm getting more radical in my old age. Usually people get more conservative, but I think we need to speak out and make demands.
Can I just add to that too, for some people who may not be aware, that we used to have a gender equity unit in the Department of Education Queensland, whatever it was called in the days in the 90s, with some amazing work coming out of there in terms of violence against women, education around, programs that they developed, resources for education for principals and teachers to use in their classrooms, and then with a whole range of other gender-sensitive policy areas and initiatives came to some demise towards the end of the 90s, really, with changes of government. But I think in terms of education, I think one of the triggers for that seems to have been that as girls started to outperform boys in terms of achievement in
Right.
non-traditional areas, science and maths and so on, that there was a sense that we've achieved gender equity now.
Yeah.
So the focus was on the education, not on the broader social context of that. So.
Well, this is it. There's another, just to add to this, there's a book I think all of you would love. It's a practical book. It's a wake-up call. It's titled The Bully Society by Jessie Klein. She was a counselor in the high school. She became a researcher. When I read her book, I went, oh my God, we have so much to do, because she focuses a lot on the technology, sexting, and all of these other things that are going on that schools are completely ignoring, and the lives that are destroyed by sexting and all these other things. And she has, her question is, how do we, she talks about the gender police in schools and how, especially in the United States where there's this hyper-masculinity with athletics and so on and so forth, and how, these things are pushed and encouraged, and anything that's feminine is bad. And that's why I get back to the technologies also, just not only the training. We have to understand that these kids are using these toys constantly, and that the education system has to target that as well. Oh, it does. We found in our Canadian National Survey, where we asked retrospectively, it started in grades 6 to 8, because they may not be dating in the traditional sense that we think, but they go to the parks and they go to movies and so on, and it's just alarming what's going on. And what we found too in research is that they actively seek out other peers to support these attitudes. Like, how do these peer groups emerge? We have to be careful about that. They're not just blank slates that come to a school or come to a program and are turned into this. These young people that we're talking about, as they move into high school, they gravitate to peers. And one of the things that, I'm sorry to sound vulgar, but this is the way it is. The number one leisure activity for many of these men is getting drunk and having sex. And they look for men who share those attitudes and values. Then they bring to university and college these things. And what makes that even more frightening, by that time, there's no problems with legal restrictions on drinking. And the pub, I would argue, or the bar, I moved totally away from psychopharmacological effects. I think the context of the pub, even though there's women not there, physically, they're always there. Because getting back to the male peer support model, they're always talking about women. She won't do this to me, or I want to get laid, or whatever. The conversation is constantly about that. And so within the context of drinking, I think it's really, really important how we target that. And I think pubs, and the Australian literature is very clear on this. Campbell's good article in The Glass Phallus, the pub is one of the most hotbeds of misogyny. This is not just Australia, this is Canada, the United States, and so on and so forth. And that's why, I think the research has been so caught up in booze as lowering inhibitions, rather than looking at what is discussed in the socialization processes within alcohol. But speaking of, just follow up, Pauline, Lee Bowker, who's done some great stuff on masculinities and violence, he would strongly advocate the model that you have, because he said, let's look at Alcoholics Anonymous. What is the goal? Now, it has some things I'm disturbed with, because it has kind of a quasi-religious element. But what he says, the principles are very interesting. How do you turn people away from drinking peers to non-drinking peers? Logic, how do you turn abusive men away from abusive men? Changing norms, attitudes, and beliefs, and looking for peers who are anti-sexist, and who share, the belief of equality and peace and so on. And I think the settings that you and Paul have are important. I mean, there's been a lot of criticism. What scares me too, Pauline and Paul, is that Molly knows this quite well. And this research, this evidence-based practice, they're out to get both of you, especially in the United States and in Canada with the anti-feminist backlash. What's happening is these programs that you have, they're saying, well, the success rates are very low. And what they're calling for is random clinical trials, which comes from a medical model. We all know that, right? And it's not applicable to human beings in that way. And they don't determine success. Now, what I've just heard from both of you is success. Success isn't simply about ending violence. Success could be increasing awareness in your community. Success could be maybe perceptions of peace. Success can be broadly defined. And so I think that's another issue that we're facing, that the problem is so complex, yet those who are against the work we do are holding us to such a higher standard that it's impossible to meet that. I don't know how any of you else feel, but in this day and age of now you have to evaluate your own program. Well, how do I evaluate? I'm spending time trying to save lives or stop men from being abusive, and you want me to do this? Yeah, I agree with you, and that's why I think London and Duluth have been so successful, because God rest her soul, Ellen Pence, developed a really good program, but there was follow-up. You can have the batterers program, the men go into their communities, but there's other institutions and groups that are there to reinforce everything that was taught in the program. And contrary to what Donald Dutton and others would say, I'd say the batterer programs in Duluth, the batterer programs in London did a great job. They were a starting point, and let's face it, that's the first place most men get, direction, right? They wouldn't get it otherwise, right? We know that they're either, told to go by a judge or their partners say they're going to leave them. So I think the batterers program is the important net, the first net. I think that's one of the most pivotal points in terms of changing men from a formal standpoint, formal institutional standpoint. That's what worries me about the assault on batterers programs. I think that there are people who are clearly, and Dutton never stops. I don't know if you know Donald Dutton, but he has his issues too. He went to the dark side because he got nailed for sexual harassment. I don't know if you know that. He was I have no problem saying this on camera because it's all, the British Columbia government has all the documents. He was once well known for his work on psychological work on wife beating, and it was quite interesting. And then he got nailed for having inappropriate conduct with a graduate student, and that's how he went to all this anti-feminist stuff. But he has this, with zeal, he goes after batterers programs and really wants to see them gone and replaced with couples therapy. Yeah, this is the big thing too now, this push for this, right? And then mediation, which, yeah, I haven't done any formal, Molly's doing work on this now, but what I'd like to do it, and I'll tell you why. This is a hot spot, and Molly's done theoretical work on this, as well as empirical work. They're supporting each other. And this is all part, Molly could talk about this with the Father's Rights movement, which is peer support. And it's international, right? Australian groups talking to Canadian. We know that's an international conglomerate. And that is a form of male peer support. And they turn to each other for advice and guidance and justification. And yeah, that's a good example. Yeah, it is. And then the dominant script is, oh, well, I can't have access to my child. Well, it's more you don't want access to your child in many ways, right? You don't want to pay child support and so on, but you try to blame women for that, right?
I think that I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce Molly, because you've referred to Molly a few times, and Molly's relatively new to Brisbane. So can you just say hello to everyone, Molly? At the risk of embarrassing you. That Bob has been referring to, who's recently joined the staff of Queensland University of Technology Crime and Justice Research Centre. So it's great to have you here too, Molly, and we're looking forward to working with you.
Well, that was a good segue, because I actually have a comment that is something that one of the things that's tricky about the work that all of us do is that, and this ties into the conversation about bullying as a generic, oh, let's respect each other, and we don't talk about, most of the bullying is homophobic and sexist, and then it's racist, and then it's about the poor kids. And so if you talk about the content of bullying with children or adults, there's very much a huge, important role of power and resources in that. And I think that we've all seen in the shift from the social movement, critical social movements from the 1960s and 1970s, where we were talking about politics, is this professionalization. We have a growth of jobs and services around violence against women, but there's also this tendency, we try not to have those difficult conversations about politics. And so sometimes we have an issue where we want to talk about what's causing violence in the community dynamics, but people don't want to hear that word, the patriarchy word. It's very unpopular. The feminism word is very unpopular. The sexism word is very unpopular. The racism word, nobody wants to talk about that stuff, but you can't talk about this issue without talking about that stuff. So Walter and I often feel like broken records, I think.
Yeah, I was so frustrated. I called, related to that point, I was at a conference, mini conference, with some of the best people in the field at University of Kentucky the other week, and I decided to speak up because there was this progressive retreatism going on again, and there, Centers for Disease Control are doing, these national surveys of intimate partner violence, and they're producing some gender-neutral results and so on, and the talk is, well, it's better than nothing, or we wouldn't be able to do this if we didn't do that. I was at a conference of people in the field, and I said something uncomfortable, but it had to be said because we're at this point now as people struggling for resources and trying to do something, we're always caving in. And by caving in, we're giving the opponents room to push us to the side. So we're saying, oh, it's better than nothing, or we had to do it this way, have gender neutral language, otherwise we wouldn't have got it. But what's happened, the reality is honestly, we are, I don't like to use this word, but we are in a war. We are in a war, and there are people out there who hate us and who want to stop the work that we're doing and are orchestrated. We talked about fathers' rights groups. They're well-oiled. These aren't lunatics on the fringe. They are well-oiled people. We have politicians who are deeply committed to eliminating violence against women legislation, and they're public about it. We have, media, Fox, Rupert Murdoch. Good God! Every time I watch in a moment of weakness, Fox News. It's terrifying. What people are saying about rape in the military. Liz Trata said, "Well, what do these feminists expect?" It's so public now that no one even thinks twice about saying the things they do. And what worries me in the change in public discourse is where the conservatives used to feel a little shy or fearful about speaking their mind. Not now. Not now. And so that's why I think we have to kind of go back to the future. This is my view. It's not because I'm nostalgic or whatever, but I think that we fought so hard to name the problem, to identify what the key factors were. And then, as Molly mentioned, that when it became an industry, then we were caught up in surviving financially. How do we keep our shelter? How do we keep our program? How do we do this? And we get worried about losing what we have. But we're going to lose it if we give it away anyway. That's the thing. We're going to lose it. They want us to lose it. And they're doing it inch by inch, which is easier for them to do, and they're letting us contribute to the self-destruction. That's my opinion, my humble opinion on it. But look at how the language has changed. How did we go from woman abuse and violence against women to intimate partner violence? How? How did we do that? Who did it? Yeah, it's an interesting point you're raising, because same in North America, drinking and driving charges are quite high for women. And people are saying this is connected with abuse as well, right? That to look at the context in which the alcohol is consumed. And what's scary, I don't know if they use it in Australia, I'm sure they do. Have you heard of the level of service inventory? Corrections people use it in North America to assess. You come in, let's say you're arrested, you're convicted, and then you go into an institution and some person sits there with, you know, a list, right, an inventory, and asks you things and determines your risk.
It's used here too.
Yeah, okay. Well, for women it's one of the worst, because what happens is when they report high levels of alcohol consumption, the fact that they were abused is completely ignored, because it doesn't address domestic violence, and so they get put into a context that's much more punitive without recognizing the past. So I think your point is very valid, also, especially from a treatment standpoint. Yeah, I think that it, you know, kind of a grassroots movement. I think we've lost a lot of ground. We gained a lot of ground. In the 80s, I think, was a great period internationally. There was such a good movement. Even the United Nations was, you know, there supporting us, and we lost so much. I'm not blaming us, but I think at first I heard many people say these fathers' rights groups, they're nothing, they're lunatics, we should ignore them. We can't. We have to fight back.
Well, I think that's probably a good note to end on. We've got to fight back. I'm not so sure about the bit, but anyway. But thank you again, Walter. It's been a real pleasure to have you. Thank you.